Greetings, brethren, and welcome to Sabbath services for this third day of January. I'm going to take a risk. Hi, I just signed on the air live with my Sabbath service. Is this Sam, perchance?
Send a voicemail. Press 2.
Okay, all right. Went to voicemail. Okay, I'm picking up a fellow in just a little bit, friends. I wanted to be sure that he and I are in communication just in case he needed me. But welcome to this Sabbath service, live stream Sabbath service for this third day of January 2015 on the pagan Roman calendar. Let's see if we can come on in. Welcome to our new Alpha 1 virtual studio setup. Let's see if I can come in a little closer, if I remember where the shots are. Okay, and we're going to come on in over here, get me a little tighter, closer to you. Even though kind of scary, but this relates in a way. Having this guy look over my shoulder like that. It relates to what we're going to talk about today, friends. But I want to mention first, I've mentioned the pagan Roman calendar date, January 3rd, 2015. For now, while we live in this world, we kind of have to put up with that and go with the flow on that and interrelate with the rest of the world, but it's really on God's holy sacred calendar. We won't just be using that calendar for the holy days in the future. That will be the calendar of every day, and this Roman calendar we have to interrelate with now will be a thing of the past. The daily, everyday calendar will be God's holy sacred calendar, the Hebrew calendar, if you will. And on that calendar, it's the 12th day of the 10th month, as you can see on my lower third on the left side of it. It means that we've got the rest of the 10th month, all of the 11th month, all of the 12th month, and the first 14 days of the first month until the next feast day. It's not a holy day, but it is a feast day, as it's listed in Leviticus 23, the most sacred feast day of the whole year, the Passover memorial. And that's just a little bit more than 3 full months away. We're at the 12th day of the 10th month, and the Passover is the 14th day of the first month on God's sacred calendar, so you got 2 days and 3 months before Passover. Easy to count it when we utilize God's holy sacred calendar every day. And I do that, even though I don't draw attention to it on the Nightcast news program, because I do have people watch the news who have not been in and who are not part of the Church of God that many of you here today on Sabbath service are a part of. But so I don't draw too much attention to the Hebrew calendar during the week, but I keep it on the lower third just as a point of reference for those of us that are familiar with the Hebrew calendar, and just it helps us know where we are in relation to, hey, when next holy day coming up? Well, we're 12th month of 10th. We're the 12th day of the 10th month. Next feast day is not until the 14th day of the first month. Okay, now that we've really touched base heavily on the calendar, let me tell you what we're going to do today. There's been quite a bit of talk this week because of a Ambassador College UK graduate who has put out a report that he's done, a very well done report on how if Christ comes on the Feast of Trumpets, as we've always looked at that as being the time of Christ returns, for a long time in the church we were taught that would be the day of Christ return. Now, Mr. Armstrong has relaxed on that a little bit to give some leeway to say, yes, the Feast of Trumpets pictures the return of Jesus Christ, and most things in the past have always been done on the holy days that the holy day refers to, but the Father and Christ are not locked into that, especially on that holy day, because as Christ said in Matthew 24, he will cut short the time, else man would have blown himself off the face of the earth. Now the Father made Passover work out so that Christ was actually crucified on Passover Day, but there's nothing that says they'll do that per se. And I know as I say that, there are many of you who maybe feel like I feel about that. I'm saying, yeah, okay, speak on, Stephen, but I really believe Christ will return on the day of the Feast of Trumpets. And there are actually a lot of people that believe that way. He doesn't want me to mention his name, but I am going to mention his first name. He does deserve some credit, and even if his report with some earlier things he did some factual things on doesn't work out, that Christ will be returning on the Feast of Trumpets in 2018, he's come up with some very interesting information to show how something that Christ told us to do. You know, I think better than having this guy poke over my shoulder as I talk, you're making me a little nervous. We'll put him back up there when we need to. But I'd rather put a verse of Scripture up there that we're going to be focusing on today, friends, from Daniel 12. Mr. Armstrong, let's actually, instead of verse 11, though, let's put Daniel 12:12 up there, and we'll work backwards, because 1,335 days comes before 1,290 days. And because if you're counting down from something, if you're count down to zero, you count from 1335 to then 1290 to then 1260, and then down to 0 day and hour when Christ returns. And he may decide to cut that short, because in Matthew 24 verses 20, 21, 22, Christ says he will cut it short. Let's read those verses just to get that in mind. And then I'm going to read you an article from a Jewish encyclopedia that will relate, and I'll tell you exactly what I'll give you an idea what, if you haven't seen it or heard about it yet, I'll give you an idea what Jeff's report talks about in a moment. But let's just go ahead and go through this verse in Matthew 24 first. Starting in verse 20 of Matthew 24, Christ says, "But pray," and this is a good day to remind us of this, "pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day." Now, what flight are we talking about? Before we read the next two verses 21 and 22 that I wanted to focus on, let's flip over to Luke 21, a parallel chapter to Matthew 24, and verse 36, and see an instruction from Jesus Christ that's kind of an instruction that we use as a goal or a guideline for our weekly news program called Nightcast that Mr. Robert Collins started in Alabama, that I helped him start after one of our local Alabama brethren, and we'll give him a salute. Ray Green came over and mentioned some things in the daily news. He was watching news. He mentioned something from the news, and that'll be a little bit fair to Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins hadn't been out of the hospital by too many days or weeks when Ray came over and mentioned some current news, and Mr. Collins' doctor, who released Mr. Collins only if he had a 24/7 caregiver, which I agreed after Mr. Collins asked me would I do that for him, and he was going to put him in a nursing home if he didn't have a caregiver, but he had told Mr. Collins he only has 3 weeks to live anyway, and so he said, but it'll be helpful. He might live a little longer if you make him as happy as you can. Let him watch whatever he wants to watch, especially watch things that might make him laugh and things that he really enjoys. Well, he really enjoyed Westerns, so I went out and purchased dozens of Bonanza videos, which he loved. And so we were watching, and then I ordered DVDs online with hundreds of Bonanzas on those DVDs, and we'd spend the days, for a few days after he's out of the hospital, watching Bonanza all day long, and funny things too, things to make him laugh. And I was spending a lot of time cooking and purchasing all organic foods for him. He lived a year longer, by the way, than the doctor said he would live. And during that year, after Ray Green comes over and chews us out, after Ray mentions some current day's news, chews us out for not being familiar with it and not watching as Jesus Christ told us to do. You guys aren't watching world news like Christ told us to do. And neither are a lot of other brethren, Ray said. Like, it's all our fault that, a lot of other brethren aren't doing it. And this is a time when, apostasy time, when congregations of brethren are all broken up, and some following this minister and some following that minister, and as currently is the situation today. But when Ray left, Mr. Collins said, Steve is right. We about what Christ said. Let's read that verse. In verse 36, Luke 21. Watch you therefore. Now some don't even read the rest of this and say, well, that just means watch yourself and obey God's laws, and be sure examine yourself like for Passover, and watch yourself and make sure you're obeying God. Well, yeah, it has that dual meaning, but more so and expressly, Christ is saying this in a chapter where he's just been describing the seals of Revelation 6 in plain language. He's describing the activities of those seals in plain language. And he's saying the first 4 seals are very active, and they're going to get more active toward the end, such that when you see the leaves turn tender on a fig tree and they start to, that summer is nigh. And so likewise, when you see these things happen, know that the next major event in prophecy is nigh, is near. The 5th, which is the 5th seal, the Great Tribulation. Know that it's nigh when these other things really escalate, as if they were budding like the tender branches of a fig tree. And he said, watch you therefore. Watch these things that are active now, and when you see them really speed up, you'll know. But he says, watch and be a part of what's happening. Pray always. Watch you therefore and pray always. And he holds out a promise, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass. And what are all these things that shall come to pass? They are those things that begin with the 5th seal, the Great Tribulation, which Jesus Christ tells us in Matthew 24, 20, 21, 22. We'll go back to that in a moment. He says that we can escape. Because, he says we can escape in verse 36 of Luke 21, I just read you. I'm trying to rush, friends, because I want to read you something and then go pick up a brother that got abandoned from where he usually fellowships and get together with him today. And he's not able to watch this at the moment here, but what was I going to say to you? Okay, let's read the rest of Matthew 24, verses 20, 21, 22. Verse 20 says, But pray that your flight be not in winter. That relates back to verse 36 we just read, where Christ holds out the promise where he says that you may be accounted worthy to escape. Escape what? The Great Tribulation. And pray that your flight in escaping the Great Tribulation be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So there's some good instruction for us today on this Sabbath. Pray that our escape that isn't necessitated that we begin the escape on the Sabbath, and that it doesn't happen in the winter either. For, verse 21, then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. A time so bad, it's never been so bad, and thankfully, he promises it'll never again be as bad. And verse 22, except those days be shortened. This is where I was trying to focus this in on for what I'm saying to you here. Except those days should be shortened, cut short. There should no flesh be saved alive. Christ has to intervene. He has to cut it short. So This is the only feast day that Christ may preempt coming on the actual feast day. And because he says elsewhere, no man knows the day nor the hour, then I'm going to see who this is calling, friend, and that's Sam. Hey, Sam, now, I'm in the middle of a live telecast. Are you okay where you are?
Send a voicemail.
Oh, okay. All right, he already went to voicemail. So, friends, that's a legally blind fellow, so I've got my phone with me, and I'm sorry for the interruption, but I don't want to leave him stranded. And I'm due to leave in just a few minutes after I read something to you and go pick Sam up. But, friends, what was I going to say to you? Okay, now, the report that is circulating that, frankly, it scared me a little bit. I thought, whoo, wow, let me back up and explain something. Now, some people believe Christ will return on the Feast of Trumpets, and even if he cuts it short, it may be something close to that, maybe even within a day of it, or maybe a week or two, whenever he has to cut it short. And he said, pray that our escape be not in the winter. So that maybe means he's going to come at a time different than Feast of Trumpets, because if it's on Feast of Trumpets, to get to Feast of Trumpets, the first Feast of Trumpets that Christ could return, if he actually came on the Feast of Trumpets, and this is the point to understand in relation to this report that's circulating that I'm going to tell you about today. The first Feast of Trumpets that Christ could return on, allowing for 1,335 days that God mentions through Daniel in Daniel 12:12, would be Feast of Trumpets in 2018, allowing for the fact that before the 1,260 days that God's brethren are in a place of nourishment, final training, protection, safety, as we often call it, a place of safety, allowing for that 3.5 years, plus another 30 days, that's that 1,290 to 1,290 day to 1,260 day period where the abomination is set up and it's time to flee. Zoom. We'll go through the verses in just a moment that relate to that. But then, as this verse shows you, now do I have a way to pull this forward? I think I do. Let's see. As this verse mentions here, friends, and Mr. Armstrong encouraged us to study the days that this verse in Daniel 12, verse 12 relates to. This is what starts it all. It starts with 1,335, then 1,290, then 1,260, then the 0 day when Christ returns. This verse says, verse 12, Daniel 12, blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1,305 and 30 days. In other words, to the 1,335 days. Blessed is he that waits. Now, there's nothing else that mentions 1,335 in the Bible. So, except that Daniel says in one place that, the wise will understand. Well, we want to be wise, brethren, so I'm drawing your attention to this, asking you to pray about it as I'm praying about it, and also asking you some of you, to fast about it. I'll just tell you, I fasted about this yesterday. I will be fasting about this again. I encourage you to fast about it. Christ told his disciples, hey, while the bridegroom here, who wants or needs to fast while the groom is present? But when I go away, then you will fast often. And so, brethren, if you're only fasting on the Day of Atonement, I encourage you to please remember Jesus Christ's words saying that when he's away, and he's not only away right now, we don't have a Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong. And we have some who are either pretending to be or some trying to be a good minister and servant to you, and some who've set up organizations with headquarters here and headquarters there, and they refer to their operation with a headquarters as if we were back in the old operation under Mr. Herbert Armstrong, where there was one place of organization on the earth from which God was working with one headquarters. We don't have that anymore. We have some who are claiming they have it, would like to think that they have it, would like brethren to think they have it, so as many as possible will come to them. But we don't have that right now. We're very, very scattered. It's kind of similar to what God says through the writing in Acts 8, beginning in verse 1 and then especially in verse 4, where he mentions the church of God scattered abroad. Now, don't anybody try to incorporate that just to make sure nobody else had a right to it. I put it in the corporate papers for Mr. Robert Collins after he disbanded a group that he had with a blankety-blank Church of God name on it, something he decided to do after God showed him he should in the hospital. And then when he told me about it, I said, hey, I'm 100% with you. That's exactly what I believe, and I believe that's why God put him and me together. And when he did file some corporate soul papers for those who were, there were some tithing to him. And brethren, the tithe money, your tenth, the first tenth of your money that you earn, the money that you earn, it's not yours, it's God's, and you need to be on your knees, maybe reading the booklet, Ending Your Financial Worries, which tells you how to figure out what to do with God's tithe money. And there were some who decided to tithe Mr. Collins, and some of you maybe have selected a minister you want to put God's tithe money to, and I wouldn't knock anybody who's doing that. And in fact, would encourage you, that's probably a good idea to help your minister who spends full time doing the best he can under these scattered conditions we're under to serve you. There are still ordained ministers when you need an anointing. God is still doing his best healing when you call upon one of his ordained ministers to anoint you with oil. But what I want to emphasize today is not that. But we're touching on things that relate to this. The countdown to the return of Christ begins with 1,335 days. And Mr. Armstrong, though he wasn't able to tell us a lot about it, before he died, just months before he died, in one of his speakings, he said to us, and brethren, you should be studying and looking at these days, the 1335, the 1290, and the 1260, he said. And so I have listened to his sermons, transcribed many of them, taken transcripts and run searches on every word he said and looked for every time he's mentioned 1335. Asked John Bowles to help me with that, and he came back with something the other day I appreciated from a pastor's general's report where Mr. Armstrong had some comments about that. I'll read you next Sabbath. What I want to do this Sabbath is read you just a couple of verses and an article from a Jewish encyclopedia, and then I've got to go pick up a friend of mine. And if he calls, I'm going to interrupt us and take that call again, friends. So let me get to this. And first of all, that verse we mentioned, Daniel 12:12, that I just put on the screen, that's the starting count point. Blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1,335 days. Now, in the verse just before that, let me put that on the screen. In verse 11 of Daniel 12, God says there through Daniel, and from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days, 1,290 days. So there's your 1,290. And that's a cue for us to escape. And by 1260 be in the place of nourishment that God will take those who are accounted worthy on the two wings of an eagle. Now that's a symbolism, and it means God will get you there. He'll fly you there somehow. We don't know yet. And if you're not supposed to be there, and if you're not accounted worthy to escape, even if you know where your brethren and friends are going, you won't be able to go there. That's a place of protection that's only for those who are accounted worthy. And so it behooves us to be sure we're doing what Christ said. And he says, he gave us the criteria for that in one simple verse, Luke 21:36. Watch and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to escape. I mean, there's a promise that's tied to something express, something very specific. God wants us to be watching and praying always. He wants to be hearing from us when anything in the world happens, and asking God to do His will on it, and maybe even putting some input to Him. Hey, God, did you see this? Are you thinking about that poor guy over there that his parents were killed? Would you comfort the guy, and will you help bring your kingdom a little faster because of my prayer and my brethren's prayers? And he says you'll be accounted worthy to escape. And through his servant, Mr. Herbert Armstrong, God encouraged us to study the 1335, the 1290, and the 1260. We're going to be doing that here. But let me mention first, I don't have this scripture to put on the screen for you, but an email from one of my friends this morning. He mentioned Daniel 12, verse 1, and he quoted it from the Jewish, online Jewish Bible. That verse reads, "And from the time the daily sacrifice was removed, and the silent abomination placed," sounds like he's quoting verse 11, and he might have just left off one of the ones when he sent me this email. He's calling this Daniel 12:1, but it may well be Daniel 11 that he's quoting from an online Jewish Bible. "And from the time the daily sacrifice was removed," you see here in the King James Version, it says basically the same thing. "And from the time the daily sacrifice shall be taken away," same as removed, "and the abomination that makes desolate," the King James says. The online Jewish Bible reads, and the silent abomination placed," is 1,290 days. Okay, so my friend misquoted it. He should have been saying verse 11, like it says here in the on the slide, quoting the King James Version. And he mentions in his email, I'm just going to go through his email real quickly because I can just spit this out reading it and then read you the encyclopedia article on that relates. "Jesus gave us this end time warning," my friend says in his email. He says, "When you therefore shall," and he's quoting Christ, "when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand." Matthew 24, verse 15. In Mark's account we read, "But when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understandeth, then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains." Mark 13, verse 14. Now, my friend points out correctly, we've learned prophecy is dual, with the later fulfillment usually the greatest. Jesus spoke of the future abomination as standing where it ought not, as a holy place. History, as we've learned through our years in God's church, speaks about the painful exploits of an Old Testament time, as my friend put it, SOB, son of Belial, not sweet old boy, named Antiochus Epiphanes, who is clearly the one who owns the former fulfillment of the abomination of desolation. We may, if we care to review this history, read the account in the Jewish Encyclopedia. And that's what I'm going to do for you next, friends, and that'll be it for today. This article says, King of Assyria reigned from 175 BC. He died in 164. He was a son of Antiochus the Great, and after the murder of his brother Seleucus, he took possession of the Syrian throne, which rightly belonged to his nephew, Demetrius. This Antiochus is styled in rabbinical sources as the wicked. Abundant information is extant. I'm reading to you from the Jewish Encyclopedia on Antiochus Epiphanes. Abundant information is extant concerning the character of this monarch who exercised great influence upon Jewish history and the development of the Jewish religion. Since Jewish and heathen sources agree in their characterization of him, their portrayal is evidently correct. Antiochus combined in himself the worst faults of the Greeks and the Romans, and but very few of their good qualities. He was vainglorious and fond of display to the verge of eccentricity. He was liberal to extravagance. Again, I'm reading to you from the Jewish Encyclopedia. I'll try to see if we can read this a little better. Let me start that sentence again that I was just reading. Antiochus combined in himself the worst faults of the Greeks and the Romans, and but very few of their good qualities. He was vainglorious and fond of display to the verge of eccentricity, liberal to extravagance. His sojourn in Rome had taught him how to captivate the common people with an appearance of geniality. But in his heart, he had all a cruel tyrant's contempt for his fellow men. The attempt of modern Phil Hellenes to explain Antiochus' attitude toward the Jews as an endeavor, quote, to reform a stiff-necked people, receives no condemnation from the fact that a Tacitus first formulated it. Antiochus had no wish to Hellenize his conquered subjects, but to denationalize them entirely. His Armenian subjects were far from becoming Hellenes simply because they had surrendered their name and some of their Semitic gods. His attempt to level all differences among the nations he ruled arose not from a conviction of the superiority of Greek culture, the true essence of which he can scarcely be said to have appreciated, but was simply a product of his eccentricity. The Jews themselves afforded Antiochus the first opportunity to interfere in their domestic affairs. The struggle of the Tobiads against the high priest Onias III, originally a personal matter, gradually assumed a religio-political phase. The conservatives, siding with the legitimate high priest, approached the king of Egypt, for they relied more on that monarch than on Antiochus, sometimes nicknamed Madman, while the Tobiads well understood that Antiochus' favor was to be purchased with gold. The Tobiads caused the deposition of Onias, or the the removal of Onias in 173, and the appointment of their own partisan Jason. In order to ingratiate himself with the king, this new high priest established an arena for public games close by the temple. But the king cared very much more for gold than for the Hellenizing of Palestine, and a certain Menelaus made use of the fact so shrewdly that he received the high priesthood in place of Jason in the year 171. But when false tidings came to Jerusalem that Antiochus had died on a campaign in Egypt, Menelaus could not maintain himself in the city, and together with the Tobiads fled to Egypt. On his return homeward, Antiochus came to Jerusalem to reinstate Menelaus, and then the true character of the Hellenism that Antiochus desired was revealed to the Jews. He entered the temple precincts, not out of curiosity, but to plunder the treasury. And he carried away valuable utensils such as the golden candlestick upon the altar and the showbread table, likewise of gold. This spoliation of the sanctuary frustrated all the attempts of Jason and the other Tobiads to Hellenize the people, for even the most well-disposed of Hellenizers among them felt outraged at this desecration of Antiochus. They must have given vent to their sentiment very freely, for only thus can the policy of extermination waged by Antiochus against the Jews and Judaism 2 years later in 168 be explained. As long as he was occupied with preparations for his expedition against Egypt, Antiochus had no time for Palestine. But when the Romans compelled him to forego his plans of conquest, his rage at the unexpected impediment was wreaked upon the innocent Jews. An officer, Apollonius, was sent through the country with an armed troop commissioned to slay and destroy. He first entered Jerusalem amicably, then suddenly turning upon the defenseless city, he murdered, plundered, and burnt through its length and breadth. The men were butchered, women and children sold into, and in order to give permanence to the work of desolation, the walls and numerous houses were torn down. The old city of David was fortified anew by the Syrians and made into a very strong fortress, completely dominating the city. Having thus made Jerusalem a Greek colony, the king's attention was next turned to the destruction of the national religion. A royal decree proclaimed the abolition of the Jewish mode of worship. Sabbaths and festivals were not to be observed. Circumcision was not to be performed. The sacred books were to be surrendered, and the Jews were compelled to offer sacrifices to the idols that had been erected. The officers charged with carrying out these commands did so with great rigor. A veritable inquisition was established with monthly sessions for investigation. The possession of a sacred book or the performance of the rite of circumcision was punished with death. On Kislev 25th, that'd be, I think, 9th or 10th month, 25th of the 9th or 10th month in 168, the abomination of desolation, mentioned in Daniel chapter 11:31, chapter 12, verse 11, was set up on the altar of burnt offerings in the temple, and the Jews required to make obeisance to it. This was probably the Olympian Zeus or Baal Shamim. Antiochus, however, had misunderstood the true character of Judaism if he thought to exterminate it by force. His tyranny aroused both the religious and the political consciousness of the Jews, which resulted in the revolution led by the Maccabees. After the passive resistance of the Hasidim, pious ones, who, much to their surprise of the Hellenes, suffered martyrdom by hundreds, the Hasmonean Mattathias organized open resistance in 166 to 167, or from 167 to 166, it should be, which through the heroic achievements of his son and successor, Judas the Maccabee, in defeating two large and well-equipped armies of Antiochus, grew to formidable proportions. Antiochus realized that a serious attempt must be made to put down the rising, but was himself too busily occupied against the Parthians to take personal charge. Lysias, whom he had left as a regent in Syria, was received instructions to send a large army against the Jews. Friends, let me take this call I told you I would need to take real briefly. Hey, Sam, will you hold on just a moment?
Okay.
Let me just finish up, and don't go away, okay? But the generals Ptolemy, Nicanor, and Gorgias, whom Lysias dispatched with large armies against Judah, hold on, I'll finish up in just a moment, okay, Sam? Were defeated one after the other, 166 to 165, and compelled to take refuge upon Philistine soil. Lysias himself, 165, was forced to flee to Antioch, having been completely routed by the victorious Jews. But although he began to gather new forces, nothing was accomplished in the lifetime of Antiochus, who died shortly thereafter in Persia in 164. And friends, that's the article I wanted to read you. We'll pick up with this and continue on it next week. Thanks for joining me. Have a wonderful Sabbath. I'm going to hook up here with Sam, and we will be back next time on live stream Sunday night with Nightcast. Until next time, this is Stephen Lloyd Gilbert saying, Happy Sabbath. Thanks for joining me, friends. And until Sunday night with Nightcast, so long, and happy Sabbath. Bye-bye.